Hello, nice to see you again. I'm Dr. Jianing Chen from BNU HKBU UIC. Welcome back to my course of the studies of contemporary Chinese linguistics. This is chapter 4, morphology. Okay, here's the outline of this chapter. In this chapter, I'm going to introduce the morphology and morpheme. Surely, I will talk about Chinese morphology, even though it is very difficult to talk about. And I'm going to discuss the definition of words in different aspects, and later talk about a Chinese counterpart of word, 字, and other related concepts, including morpheme, word, and phrase. Later, I will talk about Chinese word components, and finally, about the derivational and inflectional morphemes. Let's begin. Okay, first, I'm going to talk about morphology in linguistics. Morphology is a term can be used in different fields. In linguistics, it refers to the study of words formation, structure, and parts of words, including stem, root, affix, and so on. And also the parts of speech, for example, the intonation and stress, and the ways the context can change a word's pronunciation and meaning. That means morphology is something related to phonology, also syntax and semantics. It is something in between. If you consider the phonology as a basic level of a language study, and syntax and semantics is the upper level, and morphology is something in between. And we also need to distinguish morphology from lexicology. Lexicology refers to the study of words and how they make up a language's vocabulary. So it regards the words as a whole. It is very useful to study the lexicology when you want to compose a dictionary. But morphology mainly deal with some detailed problems. Okay, I'm going to introduce a little bit of the brief history of morphology. It is a study, okay, but it is not traditionally Chinese. It originated from Western world, including India. Okay, in ancient India, there was a linguist called Panini who was very famous. He formulated several thousand rules of Sanskrit and traditional old Indian language, morphology, in texts. Astadhyaya, by using a constituency grammar. So morphology belongs to grammar. And in ancient Greek Roman tradition, there was a long time and scholars to study grammatical tradition, also engaged in morphological analysis. And that tradition evolved finally into the modern morphology. The term morphology was created by a famous German linguist, August Schleicher, in 1859. Okay, so morphology can be regarded as the field of linguistic study morphemes. So morpheme is the core concept. Besides words, if you regard words is also very important. Besides words, morpheme is another core concept of the study of morphology. Morpheme can be defined as the smallest meaningful constituent of a linguistic expression. It is often but not necessarily a word. Sometimes it is a word, I think in most cases, a morpheme in Chinese, especially in traditional Chinese, is a word. And similar things can also happen in other language, but it is not necessarily a word. Sometimes it's not. Morphemes include roots. Roots refers to the morphemes that can stand alone. That means can be used independently as a word. For example, in English, cat. In Chinese, I think almost most of the words that a character can be stand for, fundamentally is a root. And affix only used in combination with the other morphemes. For example, the S used at the end of the word cats to imply the multiple meaning. And S here cannot be used independently. So it's an affix. It's a suffix, actually. So you can compare the similar counterpart in Chinese, men. Okay, men can be used to imply the multiple meaning of people and to some cases of other things. But it's not very usual. In most cases, it only used for human being. Okay, morphology also studies patterns of word formation within and cross language and attempts to formulate rules that model the knowledge of the speakers of those languages. That means, besides particular language, morphology can also focus on the general principle of all human beings' language concerning their words or morphemes. And the rules understood by a speaker affect specific patterns of regularities in the way words are formed from smaller units in that language, and how those smaller units interact in speech. Those are the contents that morphology studies. So, as I mentioned, almost every language can have one or more, even more morphology, because if it has many dialects, each dialect can be studied morphologically. So we're going to talk about the morphology of different languages, because different languages have different features concerning their word forming. English, for example, as an inflectional language, their speakers recognize that the words dog and dogs are closely related, differentiated only by the plural morpheme s, as I mentioned, only found bound to noun phrases. So this is a very common sense for English speakers. An English speaker recognizes those relations from their innate knowledge of English rules of word formation. Similarly, Chinese people must have their innate knowledge or idea regarding their morphology. But Chinese morphology is quite different from the Western language. Even some scholars believe that classical Chinese has very little morphology, because morphology study, as I mentioned, the formation of words. The formation of words in Chinese is very simple. It is not a very important problem. More importantly, Chinese scholars usually studied character, the writing system, instead of words. Okay, so the written form of a Chinese language traditionally is much more important than the oral form. So classical Chinese has little morphology and using almost exclusively unbound or free morphemes, and is rely on words order and functional words to convey meaning. In other words, Chinese language speakers do not tend to use morphology. They tend to use context, syntax. And also in Chinese morphology, many monosyllabic morphemes can stand alone as individual words. So words here in the typical Chinese concept is 字. They more often form multisyllabic compounds. 词. Okay, 词 here, similar to the Western linguistic concept of words. But 字 is not. But 字is very traditional Chinese. 词 here are more closely resemble the traditional Western notion of a word. A Chinese 词 can consist of more than one character morpheme, usually two. So two-syllable, disyllabic words is very common in contemporary Chinese language, but there can be more, 3 or 4, like an idiom, Chinese idiom, 成语. As I mentioned, morphology is not as important as syntax in Chinese. And all variety of modern Chinese are analytic language, so it depends on syntax more rather than morphology. Syntax here, I give some examples of the method that syntax use. For example, word order or sentence structure, they are more important in Chinese than the formation of words. And some scholars believe that Chinese has very few grammatic inflections, possess no tenses to indicate a time. You can consider whether it's acceptable opinion. What about 这了过? Are they indicating the tense, voice? What about 被? The preposition 被 sometimes express the passive voice in Chinese, right? But it is not a morphological change, but by using some particular functional words. Or numbers, as I mentioned, 们 function similarly, but in different ways in Chinese. Okay, let's move on to the various definitions of words. Even in other language, in other linguistics, word is not easy to define. Words are definable using several separate linguistic criteria. We have several definitions of word. The first, orthographic words, which means to define words by writing conventions. It is very easy for an English speaker or English writer to recognize which is the word, especially when you observe a written form. Because the written material, the letters, the group of letters written between spaces indicate a word. It is a very simple way to identify English, but there's no similar way for Chinese because Chinese is written in characters, and characters were put in sequence one by one. There's no space left between them. So Chinese is written in character, generally represent morpheme rather than words. So you cannot identify words by simple observation. The second is a lexical word. It incorporates the listedness characteristic for lexical items. What is the listedness? That means the words, all the words are supposed to be listed in a, for example, a word list or vocabulary list or a dictionary. You can deal with Chinese in a similar way, but it is not very easy. The component of grammar that contains all that is not predictable. That means each word has its own feature, so they must therefore be stored in a memorized list. You need to study and memorize the words in the list one by one. But this kind of a definition is not useful. It is not a defining concept. The listedness criteria fail to include many words created by rules, actually, or used in daily life. For example, we can find many words, oral words, without the writing form. You don't know how to write them, but you use such words in your daily life. For example, we sometimes will say 啪的一声 or 吧的一声. How to write these words? We don't know. They cannot be listed in a list. Okay, and the third phonological word, suppose that there is a potential pause. Potential pause means the place in a sentence where it is possible to pause naturally. You can stop there. You can stop between two units of a language within a sentence where there mark the boundary of words. It is actually a phonological criterion for the definition of words boundary in Chinese. Sometimes it cannot stop there. It can stop here. For example, I'll give you a sentence. 我们今天学习语言学. You can stop like this way. 我们今天学习语言学. Okay, you are not supposed to stop that way. 我们今天学习语言学. No. So where you can naturally stop, pause, there probably would be the boundary of different words. This is a good way, a very good way to test where a word begins and ends. But it is not a definition. It is not a concept definition. Again, pause cannot go where a speaker feels it is improper to pause them because their placement would violate the constituency of a syntactic, morphologic, or phonological word. This is the rationale of that method to test where a word begin and end. Okay, the first definition is a morphological word. That is the result or output of word formation rule. Is there particular word formation rules in Chinese? Let's see. Some scholars hold such ideas. For example, D. Schuler and Williams think that the set of items composing morphemes and the output of rules of morpheme combination is a morphological word. And similarly, Anderson holds that this is the base of, together with the expression of the grammatical category appropriate for as a part of speech class. This is the basic for the syntactic study. So morphology is the basis for syntax study. Anyway, we have no useful concept to definition similarly in such discussions above. And fifth is a syntactic word, which means a form that can stand as an independent occupant of a syntactic form, class slot, syntactically free form. That means in a sentence, there are some words can be appeared in a particular place, can fill the slot. Okay, and they function differently. So a particular group of words, category of words can function in a particular place. This is the basic rationale of the syntactic word. This is the most common current linguistic characterization of the notion word. It presumes that we can identify basic form, categorize, and then use native speakers' judgment to determine what entity are able to minimally occupy the category slot within utterance. It is something useful for the definition of a Chinese word. Okay, and then semantic words is more useful than syntactic words. As I mentioned, syntax is more useful than morphology when you study Chinese language, and semantics is even more. Because traditional Chinese scholar in history always studied the syntax aspects of Chinese words, but more often they study the character. Okay, but character reflect the word in classical Chinese, right? So Chinese scholars like to define Chinese words syntactically. For example, very famous linguist Wang Li used syntactic criteria, here generally corresponding to basic units of meaning, to define the words in Chinese as the smallest, independently unusable part of a language. It reminds me of the even more famous definition of words by Edward Sapir, who defined words as one of the smallest, completely satisfied piece of isolated meaning into which the sentence resolves itself. Emphasize the smallest and complete and independent use. Okay, those are the common feature or common idea between these two definitions. And finally, we have the sociological word. This definition was proposed by a famous linguist, Chinese linguist, Zhao Yunren. Professor Zhao Yunren, in his book, A Grammar of Spoken Chinese, proposed that type of unit, intermediate in size between a phoneme and a sentence, which the general non-linguistic public is conscious of, talked about as an everyday term for, and is practically concerned with the various ways. Even though Professor Zhao Yunren is very famous, but I think here's a very interesting and even funny definition, because it tells us nothing. Okay, it's natural way. It only tells us it's a natural way of Chinese speakers to feel that. Okay, because it's sociological words. And non-linguistic public, common people, is conscious of, talks about. But as we know, traditionally Chinese do not use words, okay? They use character, use 字. So in Chinese, it is the 字, meaning either the Chinese written character, 字, can be written, or the Chinese spoken morpheme. So 字 has at least two meanings. One refers to the written form of a written unit in Chinese writing. Another can refer to the one unit in spoken word, spoken language, oral form of that. It is 字. So in conclusion, we can say that there's traditionally no 词 idea. 词 originally refers to functional words, by the way, in historical Chinese dictionary or other materials. But 字 is a core concept. 字 is very similar or can be comparable to the word. In Chinese, the clear and intuitive notion is not 词 but 字. Most speakers of Chinese do not distinguish between the two meanings of 字, the two meanings I mentioned in this page, written character or spoken morpheme. Do not distinguish them when they use them. So this is the reason why we often hear about some people mention a linguistic unit in their speech, but using the 字, this term. But actually they are not referring to those written forms. Because here is a tacit assumption that the spoken 字 morpheme can always be visually rendered with a written character, 字. They are the same. They are the same for Chinese common people. They do not distinguish them. Oh, here's a very famous sentence in lyrics by Zhang Xinzhe, I think. 爱就一个字，我只说一次。我只说一次 I speak such, I say such word, okay? I say such word or such morpheme, okay? But I cannot say character, right? Because character can only be written. 爱就一个字. 字 here refers to the oral morpheme or words instead of character. But Chinese people use them interchangeably. Okay, and also very important for Chinese people, or very popular for Chinese scholars to distinguish morpheme, word, and phrase, because it's a complicated problem in Chinese language. It is very easy to identify which is the morpheme, which is the word, and which is the phrase in English, but it's not very easy in Chinese. And also Chinese scholar creates or translates technical terms for morpheme, including 词素 and 语素. What is 词素? Literally, 词素 means word element, and 语素 means language element. Okay, they are comparable. They match the term morpheme in English. And Chinese scholars have written a great deal on how to distinguish 词 from the smaller 字 and larger word groups, 词组 or phrase 短语, most often basing their decision on semantic or syntactic criteria. Semantic and syntactic, these two criteria are more important. So this is the reason why we make more sense when we discuss the definition of words of such one, semantic word and syntactic word. Make more sense in Chinese. Okay, here is the typical illustration of the relationship and the structure of the different level of morphological units in Chinese, including below sentence. Okay, there we have word and word group, 词组, and 语素组, a group of morpheme. 词, 语素 and 词 they are parallel. Okay, 语素组 and 词组 they are another group, which can be used to compose other more complicated level of linguistic units. Okay, here is a very important problem in Chinese to distinguish a word from a phrase, as I mentioned, because it is confusing. Okay, it's confusing in Chinese language. Here I'm going to discuss some examples. For example, 红鸟 and 红花. Okay, 红鸟 and 红花. Visually, they are very similar. Okay, but structurally they are different. Okay, so 红鸟 literally means red bird. Okay, there's no such possibility to explain the meaning of that, right? Only solely translated into red bird. So it means red bird. It consists of 2 characters and 2 morphemes, and it is also 2 words. 2 words means it is a phrase. It is a noun phrase. It is a noun phrase composed of a modifying adjective and a noun. 红鸟, 红的鸟. Okay? But differently, 红花 can be explained in 2 ways. If you consider it as a one concept, 红花, okay, safflower. What is safflower? It's a kind of a traditional Chinese medicine or pigment. Okay, 红花, 藏红花. Okay, 红花. It's a word. It is a word. Okay, it is not 2-word phrase. It is a word because it lack of a compositionality means they cannot substitute any without losing the idiomatic meaning. 红 and 花 here altogether matters. And if you reduce each syllable of them, the meaning change. 红 and 花 are different from 红花. 红花, okay? So if you explain that way, 红花, okay? 红花means similar to 红鸟. Okay, 红花 means similar to 红鸟. It is a phrase, okay, a noun phrase. So 红花 can be illustrated differently in 2 ways at least. So here we're discussing the generalizability and the productivity. which means if you try to substitute the adjective or the noun and see whether it still retains its compositional meaning. If it retains, that means that is a phrase. If it does not, it means that is a word. Okay, similarly, you can think of another group of example, 白马 and 白菜. 白马 and 白菜, which is a word and which is a two-word phrase. Oh, such problem can be comparable to English examples. For example, blackbird. Blackbird means literally blackbird and can also means a kind of bird. Okay, in Chinese, 画眉, blackbird, right? So, but it's not very common. Such case is not very common in English, but it's particularly common in Chinese. This way, let me ask, is there a word in Chinese? As I mentioned, it's more important of a character, okay? A character unit of a writing system in Chinese than the word. But is this still necessary for us to study the word in Chinese? Unfortunately, if we want to study morphology, we need to use this term. Okay, we need to use this term. Okay, let me discuss that problem a little bit. Because the hearer of Chinese simply gets the meaning of an utterance as it unfolds. Chinese speaker or listener has never split the different syllables. Okay, they understand the whole word, multisyllable words as a whole, without it necessarily being parsed into word size units. Okay, even it is not necessary for Chinese to split how many words in a sentence. It is no use. Okay, we don't need to know how many words in this sentence, but we understand the sentence generally as a whole. The word could be merely an artificial construct to speakers of Chinese. In Chinese, it is not an intuitive notion, right? Probably. You may answer this question, please. And the notion word is a concept that comes from Western world. Yes, it is so.